This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine, online at computer.org/software.
Hello everyone, this is Felienne for Software Engineering Radio. Today with me on the show is Dr. Michaela Greiler. Michaela is a software engineer and a tech entrepreneur. She helps companies to get the most out of code reviews by offering code review workshops and by optimizing the code review process. Prior, she was a software engineer and researcher at Microsoft, where she worked with teams such as Office, Windows, and Visual Studio to improve the software engineering lifecycle. She has a PhD from Delft University of Technology and 15 years of experience analyzing and improving software engineering processes. She also runs the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. Welcome to the show, Michaela.
Hello, hi Felienne, I'm really happy to be here.
The topic of today's show is code reviews, which are your absolute expertise. But what exactly is a code review? Could you share your definition of what a code review is?
I would say in a traditional sense, a code review is a feedback process or a feedback loop. So you can say one person develops some code, might be a bug fix or it's a part of a feature. And then at least one other colleague or peer looks over the code changes and gives feedback. With all the time that I spend understanding code reviews, I like to see it or view it as a collaboration mechanism. So it's really that we stay in contact and discuss code and bond together. Yeah.
So those were already two goals that you stated. Firstly, giving feedback, and secondly, a means of communication about the code. So is that summary correct?
Yes, that's very true. That's very true, yeah.
Then why do we do code reviews? What do they add? Because there are other means of giving feedback, like unit tests or integration tests. What do code reviews specifically add to the process of giving feedback as a means of communication about the source code?
Well, I think code reviews, they have their own role and goals, right? So for example, with the testing, you're actually looking at the correctness of the code, or if the code is bug-free, or that the cases that you're covered, perform as you expected. I think code reviews are completely different in that regard, because what you do there, you get feedback from your peers about, for example, the readability of the code, but also the maintainability. You also get a knowledge sharing aspect. So because your colleagues will look over what you actually developed, they know what you're working on. They know how the system looks like. And I think that's really a really important aspect of code reviews. And you don't get that with testing, for example.
To summarize that, it's like testing, but code reviews are richer. There's more that you can get out of a code review than simply understanding if the code is working correctly.
Yeah, I think they are actually not even a good mechanism for ensuring that the code behaves correctly. I know that people state one of their primary goals that they find defects and, have accident prevention from code reviews. But code reviews aren't really designed for that. People are much better to detect other things, right? So if that's your primary goal, then I would say you should invest more in testing, for example, or monitoring or things like that. But people are good in understanding things that the system can't do. So, for example, they would say that design pattern doesn't fit right there or isn't implemented in the correct way, or that piece of code is somehow fragile or not maintainable. I don't understand how you wrote that. So you're improving the code base and the quality of the code base, but it's not really about the bug prevention. There is an aspect of it. So we did some studies at Microsoft, and others studied that as well. And we saw that around 15% of the review comments are about defects. That's only a small portion. Most of it, more than 50%, is really about maintainability of the code, readability of the code. That's maybe why my definition of code reviews is more as a collaboration mechanism, to just highlight to people that the benefits that they get out are much richer. I mean, obviously, you don't want to pass on those 15% of defects, but the time that you spend is it's really about knowledge sharing. It's about collaboration and talking about the code. And I think code reviews are so good because they have the reality right there. So it's somehow grounded in code. Your discussion isn't about some high level feature and you're just imagining how that would be. And the other tries to explain how they have implemented or will implement, but you see it right there. It's written there and that's how it is. And so I think it's a very grounded discussion basis.
That actually segues really nice into my next question, because you just mentioned that just 15% about comments on code reviews are about defects or bugs, and that 50% is about maintainability. So I was going to ask, what evidence do we have that code reviews work? What do we know about the effects of code reviews?
So again, I would say it really depends on what work means to you. So if you talk about whether code reviews improve the code base, then I would say yes, there is evidence. For example, there have been studies at Microsoft and at Google that look at whether code reviews trigger changes. And yes, at Google, for example, 80% of all the code reviews trigger a change. Now, of course, you might say, well, how do we know that those changes, are improvements? But I would argue that most likely if two people or two engineers agree on a change and they say it makes sense, then it will be an improvement to the code. At Microsoft, we went even a little bit further. And we worked with several teams to understand what constitutes valuable feedback, code review feedback. And developers clearly indicated that feedback that leads to a change is valuable to them. So yeah, I would say my answer is yes, there is evidence that there are positive changes happening to the code base. But I also think that maybe we don't even need that scientific evidence to come to that conclusion. Just if we think about ourselves, whether it is that we are writing code or maybe we are just writing something, right? If we ask somebody else with a different pair of eyes, right, with a different perspective to look through that, with a different expertise, maybe what we have will be improved. That's why high quality publications, for example, have editors or proofreaders. So I think that we know that it will work in that respect. But now, if you think, does it work in other areas, for example, for knowledge sharing, then I would say yes, obviously, because if you actually look at the review, so if it's not just a window dressing activity that you do and nobody actually looks at the review, then you will know more about what's going on in your system. And if somebody points something else, you will learn. So yes, you have those aspects, and I think they work. Maybe a more tricky question is whether or not they are worthwhile the additional work that you put in, right? Because they are expensive. I mean, they require quite some work from the engineers.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into this trade-off between spending time on a code review and maybe spending time elsewhere. But firstly, let's back up a little bit and let's talk about the code review process. So how do we do a code review? Are we in one room? Do we do it remotely, maybe through GitHub? What is the setup? What are different variants or different forms you can do a code review? Could you take us through your favorite form of doing code reviews?
Yeah, that sounds good. So the actual life cycle of a code review or the process can look quite different. So I start with a very informal type. We call it the over-the-shoulder review, which just means that at one point a colleague comes to you or you ask them to come to you and you just look at some piece of code together. And they give you feedback about it, or you're discussing a problem together. So that's one way to do code reviews, right? And you see some similarities to pair programming there. But there's also those code reviews, and I think that's really previously how they have been in a much more formal way. So that's on the complete different other side, right? So that would be, for example, code inspections that have been very popular. And they are much a more formal process. So you have really larger parts of the code base that you look through, and it's a meeting-like setting. There are many people, and they have checklists and inspection lists, and they go through it one by one. It takes a lot of time, and they are still done for certain kind of softwares or for certain kind of companies. You still see inspections happening. But nowadays, I think if we talk about code reviews, what we envision, what's the typical process is this asynchronous way of looking at code. So one person develops some code. Let's say they have a bug fix or a feature, and then they work on the code until they are thinking they are in a good state, that they solved their problem, for example. And then they will send that code, depending on the tool that you use, it will look different, but somehow send that code over to colleagues, 1, 2, 3 colleagues. And those colleagues look at their own time through the code and just annotate it, give feedback. So one of the areas where code reviews have been really popular was the open source community. And there they used email, for example, to do that. So somebody would create a patch for some open ticket, and then they would create a patch, so a package of code, and send that via email. And people would start to discuss that patch on the email list. So they would say, oh, you haven't looked at that corner case, or, oh, I'm not so happy with the validation that you did there, or the design doesn't fit, or something like that, right? So they would comment about that. And the really nice thing was, especially in the open source community, that because it happened on this email list, people stayed informed. So even if you are not commenting on, you could always read it. So there's some traceability aspect. Nowadays, I think a lot of teams do it either with a standalone tool. So for example, Gerrit or Crucible or Fabricator. So these are all code review tools. And you can imagine that it's like an IDE, so your integrated development environment, but you have some special functionality to comment on that. And then you send it feedback, and people will change the code based on what you said. And so it's an iterative process as well. So I think that's a very, very common scenario right now. Also pull requests. So with the area of pull requests, code reviews become more popular, because you just have to imagine that instead of you pushing the code somewhere, it's always the same person that is in control. Somehow somebody had to pull your version in, and a very natural step that they would do is they look over what they're actually pulling in, right? So they look over the changes that happened and maybe give some feedback. At least they say it's okay or it's not okay. I'm going to merge it or I'm not going to merge it. And I think in this pull request model, more and more companies also naturally fall into that code review habit, right? So they are doing code reviews whenever they have to do a pull request, or for other systems now, a merge request and things like that.
What you're saying, I think, is that there's a large variety of ways to do a code review, and that it's a matter of practice what fits your company and your code base more.
Yeah.
But do you think that for some types of code bases, some types of reviews fit more? I think you hinted this a little bit when you said for some types of software, a meeting might be more needed. Do you think there must be a fit between the type of review or the form of the review and what your company is building, or how your company is building things?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it's the same as with testing, right? If you have like a system that people's lives depend on, you will have a much more rigorous and probably also much more formal process around ensuring that everything is okay than if you have like a website that, even if something slips through, is problematic. And I think nowadays people tend to have more lightweight process in general. And I think that they still cover a lot of the things, especially for this readability and maintainability aspects. They're very well suited. I think that you can have combinations as well. Like you have some, inspections or some reviews. I mean, I think, for example, architectural discussions can also be seen sometimes as code reviews, right? If you really look at the code and you're deciding which architecture you should implement, for example, I think it's a part of a code review as well.
So definitely much more broader than just reading source code.
Yes. And I think it's not only about the company, but also the current goal that you have, right? What do you want to achieve? And then you will pick one of those things. So you will have an ad hoc meeting and more informal process for more contagious issues, right? So if you think, somebody might be offended if I say that, probably not good if you just write it and then send a button. Might be better to just call them and discuss in person, something like that. Yeah. So I think it really depends not only on the software, but also the situation that you are in, whether or not you would choose one or the other.
Now, I'm also thinking back at your first remark about the different goals of code reviews, like giving feedback to each other or communicating about the code and gaining understanding. Do you think that different forms of code review also fit different goals that you can have with a code review?
I think that different forms might prevent to get some of the benefits, or that different forms, trigger some of the drawbacks. I would rather phrase it that way, I think. So, for example, for the pull request, it sometimes happened that you would wait too long, right? So the code review gets actually quite large. You don't see this single commits, but there are workarounds. So some of the people, for example, would create a pull request at the moment that they start working on a feature. And then they call it, for example, WIP, work in progress, right? And so everybody knows, well, that's actually not a real pull request right now. It just gives you a window to look into what's happening here. So in general, I think, it depends on the goals that you have. And then how can you use the tools to achieve your goals? And if you want to have people look at your code in smaller increments and just be informed, then you will have workarounds if your tooling doesn't allow that.
I also want to talk a little bit about the scope of a code review. What should a code review cover and what shouldn't a code review cover? We already talked about bugs, for example, defects being in the scope of a code review. But what about a new feature? Could a code review be about, is this feature completed? Is it ready to be released? Or is that something that more fits user testing or something entirely different?
Yeah, again, I would say it depends on your goals. I know that's I say that a lot, but I think that's also why it's so important for the team or for the company to be really crystal clear about their strategy and what do you want. I would be cautious to, put additional burdens on the code reviewer without knowing why I'm doing that. I don't say that you shouldn't do it, but it's a definitely additional burden, right? And a code reviewer isn't your tester, so they shouldn't go and test the feature. Whether or not all the features are there is, for example, it's a part of your definition of done. And very often, for example, product owners would have those responsibility. Maybe they do that as their part of their code review process, right? But I don't think that everybody has to check for that. I think in the area of UX, for example, it gets also very interesting. So if it's easy, I would do it. So for example, if you're making a change to the user interface, make a screenshot and attach it. And if your tooling allows it, and there are developments in that area that code reviews, for example, have runnable versions of a current code and that are somehow sent with it. So the person just has to click and sees exactly what that code entails, right? Then you could think about whether or not that person should go and check out the UX, how it's really working. But you have to be clear if that's what you want. Maybe it's just one team, right? Maybe it's just a UX team that has that process because for them it makes sense. And is it actually connected to your code? Maybe you don't have to have the code there. Then why is it part of the code review process? So I think the most important thing is that you are very reflective about what do you want to achieve and does it fit very well into your process, into your practice? Are you achieving it in an effective and efficient way?
I think the biggest takeaway for me here is that before you start doing code reviews within a company, you should make it clear what the goal is. So is the goal to check features and releases? Is the goal to have less bugs? Is the code review to have a better quality of the code? And then while you're doing code reviews, you should actually reflect back on that goal and see, hey, are the code reviews actually reaching the goal that we initially set in mind? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yes, exactly. So I think that one of the biggest benefits that teams get out of is that knowledge is really shared among team members. So if somebody is sick, others know what's going on and know about the code base. So you're breaking up those working in silos style of working. So I think if you then want to achieve different things, you have to be, as you said, very conscious about what do you want to achieve and how would I design my code review process to fit that need? And then also, over time reflect, am I actually achieving what I wanted to achieve with that? And if not, change it.
So I want to zoom in a little bit onto the two sides of code review, because of course there's the side of giving feedback and there's the side of receiving feedback. So I really want to hear your tips for both sides. But let's start with the giving feedback sides. What are your best practices to give feedback in a constructive way to make sure that the other party actually understands what you're saying and that their feelings aren't hurt in such a way that they're not open for more feedback?
as you said, there is much that can be done, right? So I would say if I'm the code reviewer, the first question that I would ask myself is, how can I add value? And very often in life, that's a question you can ask yourself, right? How can I add value? And then the second question is, how can I convey that value in a positive and constructive and respectful way? So it's really, really important the way you give feedback. As you said, how can I make sure that I'm not hurting feelings? Because feedback, even though, it's well written, it's well intended, it can sting. And that's just human nature. So for the person that gives feedback, we have to be careful how we phrase the feedback. A good rule, for example, is that you can phrase your feedback as questions, not as a demand. So, for example, you could say, what about open request as the name for the variable? Instead of saying, rename the variable to open request. And in that way, you leave the final decision to the author, to the developer that actually authored the code. And you also show that you're open for discussion. So somehow it becomes a collaboration instead of, you're the dictator, you are in control because you're the reviewer and you say it has to be that way. Something else you can do for feedback is you can phrase it as I messages. And that's really important. So for example, you could say this part, it's hard for me to understand this part of the code, right? So that would be a nice way to formulate it. It's hard for me to understand this part of the code. Instead of saying, this code is hard to understand. And there is a big difference. So one is really about me, and it's really hard to argue about that because for me, it's hard to understand. And it's easy for the other person to be open and receive that message, whereby if you say, this code is hard to understand, it's a fact. And you can argue against it. Well, I understand it, right? So I think that's there's a subtle difference, but it's a very powerful one. And you also should make the comments really about the code and not the person. So let's imagine you say something about the socket connection, and you could say, this code does not close the socket connection, right? Instead of saying, you are not closing the connection, right? And while there are much more rules about respectful and constructive feedback that people can read about, and I think they should be aware of how to phrase things in the right way. But besides how you convey the message, I think it's really important also to think about what is the message. So as I said, again, how can I add the value? And at Microsoft, for example, we did a study where we looked at millions of code review comments, and we classified them into valuable and not valuable comments for the author. And it turns out that people want to hear about defects, alternative solutions, missing validations, best practices, but they don't want to hear about things that are out of scope for the code review, right? So again, that's why I said previously, should you do those additional steps? Well, if it fits and if people agree that it's valuable to them, do them. Otherwise, don't do them. So for example, code reviews are normally not the place to discuss existing technical debt. If it hasn't been introduced with that change, don't go around and poke in that file and say, look, over there is something that you could fix as well. Or, don't start planning discussions or things that are discussions about future things that you should work on code reviews, because people want to have the code merged, right? So they have the goal of the submitter. The author of the code is get feedback and submit that code, merge that code. And I think so we have to be conscious about that. So I would also use a checklist so that you really know what to look for, like implementation, you look at design and architecture, security, data privacy, things like that. And then lastly, I think it's really important when you give the feedback. So I said how to give, what feedback, and then when to give the feedback, because even the best feedback isn't really a good feedback if it's a week later or 2 weeks later, right? Before the person can work on that and get to it.
These were all really great tips. Thanks a lot. So to summarize, try to add value. Think, where can I really help? Try to give feedback using the I message, like I cannot understand that code and not the code is understandable. Keep the scope focused on the current changes. Do not bring up previous technical debt or other issues with the code. And what I also very much liked is this checklist. So would you have an example of such a checklist that we could, for example, share in the show notes?
Yeah, I have a checklist. I can link that, yes.
These were all tips for the person that is giving the comments within the scope of a code review. What would be your tips for the other side? How do you deal with code reviews coming your way and with comments about code that you have contributed?
Yeah, I have, because as you said, it's a two-sided thing, right? So I think for the receiving end, it's really, really important to be humble and open-minded. I think for both of them it is, right? But the receiving end might feel, they might sometimes feel that there is a power shift between reviewer and, submitter, which you should work on. But yeah, so feedback can sting. And sometimes I think it's important for the receiving end to just step back a little bit and calm down. Let your reactions, if you think, oh, that feedback actually somehow felt uncomfortable, let it calm down and look at the feedback again at a later state, And then I think it's really important also for the receiving end to show that they actually value and consider the feedback in a very honest way. Really go and look at the feedback and have this mindset of people, we are in it together. They have a shared goal. They want to increase the quality of the code base, right? And so I think it's important that you also show that you value and consider the feedback. You say you don't have to take every feedback, right? It's not that because the person said it, you actually have to change something, but consider it and also let them know what you did about it, why you didn't change something or why you changed it, that you changed it. I think what's also important on the receiving end is not only how you go about the feedback that you get, but also how can you ensure that you get valuable feedback. And there are a few things that you can do. So a very, very good tip that we saw with very high-performing teams at Microsoft is give people a heads up, especially, if it might surprise them that they get a code review right now. Give them a heads up. Tell them, you can expect a code review today from me. This way they can mentally prepare themselves and also they can plan the time that it will take them to do the review. And the more time they have set aside for that, the more rigorously they will do the code review and the more they will add value to your code. And then also ask people that are familiar with the code base for feedback. Don't just, ask anybody. It's really hard for people that aren't familiar with the piece of code to provide valuable feedback. And another thing that is really important for the submitter is that you look through your code changes before sending them out. So if you have a dedicated code review tool, open them up. Or if you have a diffing tool, open that up and see, what's actually included in that change. And maybe even a different perspective can help you to see something with clear pair of eyes, right? So maybe you can spot some of the issues. So don't send sloppy mistakes over to the other side because that will just frustrate the other person.
To summarize, tips for receiving a good code review are hand in good work that you check extra before you send it out. Yes. Try to seek out people that really know the code that could give sensible feedback, but also try to think of people that might have a fresh perspective and be open-minded. Try to remember, even though, as you say, feedback can sting, that you're all in it together and people giving code reviews aren't enemies, but they're actually people that are trying to help you advance and help the code base advance.
Yes, yeah. I would say so. Mm-hmm.
I know some people use neutral facilitators in a code review. So what is your perspective on that? Does it add value to have someone in the room or even in the discussion, maybe on GitHub, that isn't related to this specific code and this specific code review to help facilitate discussions? Do you think that adds value or it's not worth it?
So I would really, really hope that you don't need that kind of person. That's my first reaction to that one. So I think that if code reviews are, if the process, if the team dynamics are okay, then I don't think that the facilitator is really needed. And I also, it's really hard for that person to be objective, right? And to facilitate that discussion. It's also a second person or a third person, that's spending time to do that. And I think it somehow creates a distance between the people that actually should work together, the peers. On the other hand, I think it's really, really important as well to not close our eyes for some of the drawbacks, and not even drawbacks, I would say the ugly things that can happen with code reviews. I think we have to be very frank that code reviews, there are stories. And so we have to acknowledge those stories where code reviews are used for power plays, for sabotaging people, for holding back changes. But I would argue that that isn't really something that's inherited by the code review itself. It's something that is there because of the team dynamics, because of mismatches of people. So I think it's important that we have a very safe space for our team to grow and learn. And I think the most harmful attitude is to say, oh, our team is a safe space to learn and grow, because then it never is, right? So I think there must be a constant and continuous effort from the team, from the people, towards working to such a safe space. And that's not exclusive to code reviews. It's for team collaboration and, work environment in general. So, I think that it can be helpful to go over the code reviews from time to time and just really see what's going on here. And if you feel that there is a toxic situation, a toxic environment, then, how can we make sure that people feel safe enough to talk about that? Maybe there are some personality clashes. Maybe the team hasn't bonded, right? Maybe there are hierarchies that play out in code reviews. All that can happen. But I think then it's not the fault of the code reviews. It's just a code review is a mechanism that surfaces that. And maybe that's even good, right? So suddenly you see it. I mean, that's what we hope, that we see it, that we can identify it, that we can address it. And we can work against that.
Yeah, so code reviews obviously are the place where all sorts of team dynamics and issues with team dynamics surface. And I really liked your advice of doing a code review in a sense, that every once in a while you look back at a code review and you say, oh, well, what was the added value? How was the feedback received? Should we go this way? Is the code review still going towards the goals that we set for it? I really like that. But even in a very safe environment, I would say it's different if I, as a more senior person, give feedback to a junior team member than the other way around, right? Even if in a super safe environment where you really like working with each other, seniority still there's a different dynamic from a senior to a junior than the other way around. Do you agree? Or would you say if everyone is super happy working together, that difference shouldn't matter at all?
Yeah, I think 100%. That's exactly what I would say. That's why I said if you say you have a safe space or place, then you don't have it, because we are all humans and, this will happen for juniors. It's just natural that they are intimidated by code reviews, that they are intimidated by the role that they are put in. I mean, imagine, it doesn't matter if they're receiving or providing, and they just came into that team. They are new. The people that, talk to them or give them feedback, that they interact with, they are strangers. They are not familiar with the code base. They're not familiar with the company, the processes. Maybe they don't even know the technologies that they have to use, right? So they are in a very vulnerable position. It's not a comfortable position to be in. So when you give code review feedback, I think you always have to reflect on the context, the circumstances. To whom do I give feedback? In which situation, right? And then think about how can I use that to make it a learning and engaging experience that also helps to build relationships. And so, especially for the new hires, I would suggest that you do, in-person code reviews, right? So there will be a lot of feedback. I mean, it's normal. You will critique many of the things because they don't know it right now. So you have to point that out. And if it's delivered in the right way, I think it's very valuable. But I would not just, it's all red and then you throw it over, you press the button and it's delivered. I would probably do either a video chat or really walk over to that person and say, do you have time? We can go through your code review and, help that person, show that you're actually there for them. And that right now is the time to learn and to grow, and they aren't alone.
So what you're saying is, I think that in-person code reviews really make sense for new hires so they can get a sense of how a code review is done and what the current team dynamic is. Another thing I wanted to ask you is, code reviews isn't something that's typically taught in university. At least we don't teach it. I didn't learn it when I was in university. And also I think within companies is not something that people are deliberately taught. So how to get better at code reviews? Is there something like code review practice? Can you do a fake code review to get better at this?
I think I see the same things as you. For the university, I have a little bit of a hard time to talk about because it's a long time that I have been lecturing or even going to university. But when I did, well, there wasn't education on code reviews, right? I hear that some of the boot camps really briefly, mention or introduce people to the idea of code reviews. But I think it's the same. I don't think that it's done in a very in-depth way and similar to companies. So with companies, I'm very, very aware of it, that it happens very, very often that engineers are asked to do code reviews without any training, without any introduction to what is actually expected of them. And I think it has to do with that it's assumed that it's self-explanatory. Well, how hard can that be, right? Open some piece of code, look at it, give feedback. That's it, right? But that's falsity. So as we already discussed some of the drawbacks and the pitfalls, there's a lot you should be aware of, and there's a lot to learn about how to give constructive feedbacks, issues to look for, how the overall design looks like. And so there's a lot that can go wrong and a lot that can go right. And organizations like Microsoft and Google and also Facebook, they really spend time to understand the code review practices of their engineers, because engineers spend a lot of time doing code reviews. And if you just assume, everything is fine and, we don't have to improve somewhere, that's, I think, the wrong attitude. That's also when I, for example, go to some of my clients, I see that there is the awareness that they want to have the benefits of the code reviews, but they're getting a lot of the drawbacks as well. And you can do something about that. And it starts maybe with just acknowledging that there is a lot that can be learned, how to give feedback, what kind of feedback, creating awareness of the pitfalls. I think internally you could create some company internal trainings, for example, or especially the onboarding process. That's what we are looking. That's how a code review looks like. I think it's okay to, maybe pair up and show them how you do the code reviews, right? To actually practice some of the code reviews. Very often what I see is that people just learn by being thrown into the deep end. So they follow code reviews and they just read and see what other people are discussing. And then they learn that in an on-the-job way, right? Just by observing, which is okay, but there are more effective ways to do that. And if you, for example, have a toxic environment, you will just amplify that with something like that, right? So if you say our engineers just learn by just doing and participating in the code review process, they learn exactly the habits that are there. So yeah, they can learn the good or the bad parts. For example, what you could also do is could have brown bags, so lunch meetings, for example, where people introduce new topics and they could reflect on code reviews and how to do code reviews. And I think there's a lot you can do.
So you said pairing up might help, being explicit about this is how we do a code review, and maybe also come together and together reflect on the process of code reviews to get new hires to understand how it works, but also to improve the process as a whole.
Yeah, I think so. And there are several things. I mean, there are the technical aspects. So what should you look for? And I think it's really fair to give people a training for that. As I said, for example, with this code review list that I created, each of those topics can then be broken down and looked at in depth. So, for example, at Google, they have special trainings or reviews of reviewers so that they get special privileges. And one of them is called the readability certification that they can do. And so they are trained for each of the language. So let's say, for example, for JavaScript, there's one of those programs, and then there will be one for Python. And then they are really shown how a coherent, good, high quality code base looks like in that language, and what are the problems that you see in that language. So that's the very technical side of it. And I think that can be very valuable to people. You can train that yourself, or the organization can take part of that and just help the people understand how that looks like. There are the social aspects of it, and there are also the process aspects, which I think are often overlooked. People set arbitrary rules, like 2 people have to look at that code review, otherwise it can't be, merged. Could be a good thing, but maybe it's not fitting your process. Maybe it's not fitting your goals again. So I think, there is still a lot that can be done.
So I think most of what you're saying again is you really need to be explicit about your goals doing a code review.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that I do in the workshop that I give, they're normally company internal workshops. So they're all people from the same company. And we work on that together because it's really about also that the engineers, have a say in what works and what doesn't work, because otherwise they will find ways around it. So if you set arbitrary rules, that makes no sense. People will game the system and they know what they're doing, right? So I think on one hand, you have to empower the people, but also empower them to address bottlenecks that they see in the process that you might enforce on them.
So I want to talk a little bit more about different programming languages, because programming languages vary a lot in readability, in how easy it is to identify a certain feature. And you mentioned that already a little bit when you just said, I have to Google something for a certain programming language. So would you say a code review for, let's say, COBOL is very different from a code review for Haskell, or would you say it's all the same?
Well, the code review itself, I think the pure mechanics are very, very similar, right? But there's a difference in the effectiveness of code reviews and how long it takes people to review that code and in what you should look for, right? So in C, you will look for different issues than in a Java or C# language, right? Where you know that you are having, for example, the garbage collection that helps you and things like that, right? So that's why I think it's important to know about the specific of your language and then look for specific patterns that are tricky in that language. And so I would say, the code reviews look different for the different programming languages, even though from the outside, it looks all the same. What we also saw is we did a study at Microsoft where we looked at how code review feedback differs depending on the kind of code you review. And we saw that, for example, for deployment code, right, YAML files and things like that, they're just really hard to review. So there is less valuable code review feedback happening than in the normal C# files, for example. And we also saw that some of the programming languages seem to be more difficult than others, and people have harder times to point out issues.
Well, yeah, but I have a follow-up question, because now I'm curious that if people review YAML less than another programming language, is that because of inherent aspects of the programming language, or is it just because it's way less likely that people will know something about YAML than about C#? So maybe a deeper form of that question would be, do you really need a very good understanding of a programming language in order to be able to give a good code review? Or are there generic questions you can always ask even if you lack a good understanding of the programming language or the technology stack at hand?
I think there are several things that you just addressed that I would like to come back. So especially with the YAML files, I think there are several things that can influence the outcomes, right? It's a study. And so we couldn't control for everything. I think these are really interpretations of the results that we think for the YAML file, it could be that it's just that the syntax highlighting isn't so nice, right? Or that they are just really large files. Some of the things that you said that people are not familiar with that, or not so many people are familiar, definitely plays into that, because what we see, and that's there's very strong evidence for that, is that people that aren't familiar with the technologies or the code base even, right? It's not even the technologies, but the code base that they are looking at, they really have a hard time giving valuable feedback. So what we saw, for example, is people that are just starting within a team. They are onboarded in a team, and even if they're seniors, they take quite probably half a year to give the same constant valuable feedback as their peers. And that has to do that they don't know. And it's also very advised that people that you ask for feedback have at least reviewed the code, especially this piece of code that you're looking at, or changed it, and they will give much more valuable feedback. So experience has a lot to do with the way you can give valuable feedback and you can contribute. It's just, if you don't have the experience, it will take you much longer, and it will be very hard for you to give interesting feedback or helpful, constructive feedback.
Yeah, that makes sense. In order to give some feedback, at least you have to know something. But then another question popped into my mind. You also mentioned with the YAML files, you said, well, maybe they don't have proper syntax highlighting in most IDEs. And that got me thinking of tool support in general, which was also on my list of things I wanted to ask you. What type of tool support can really support a code review? What do you need? What can really help? Is this within the IDE? Is this within a version control system? What are features that really support code reviews well?
Yeah, it's a broad question. So I hinted at that at the beginning. So in the basic form, people are just sending emails, right? So they add some patches, some code files, maybe some, divs that don't have a lot of visual clues, and they write emails back and forth. And then we can go to dedicated solutions, standalone solutions that obviously they are really trying to focus on how can you improve that experience. And they will have diffing, and then you can, switch up the way you see the code. Maybe you have side-by-side diffs, maybe it's, merged in. Then a lot of them allow to communicate per line, or even, have multiple lines. Also, GitHub right now added the multiple line comment, which for standalone tools has been already there. But now you can also, at GitHub, for example, select multiple lines and comment there. And those commenting things are nowadays very often in such a thread. You can imagine that, like, for example, in social platforms like Twitter, Facebook, where you have like one person is commenting and then you can reply and you see very nice the nesting of it. You can resolve comments. There's really a lot that happens around this commenting functionality. How can you resolve threads? How can you have pending? Then there are toolings around that help you to don't forget the code reviews, right? So maybe they ping you in the chat, maybe in Slack or in Microsoft Teams. And nowadays I see more and more tools that allow a much more, collaborative way of code reviews and more integrated. So there are also tools that allow you, again, to stay in your IDE and write a comment, and maybe that the person that you want to talk about, you look that up with, for example, git blame, and you write them a message, and you can do that within the IDE. So there is quite some development happening in that space, and I think they are getting more modern right now. And I think it's really going towards this continuous feedback loop, this continuous and collaboration efforts that you have.
Yeah, that's definitely a space where a lot happens, like within IDEs and within GitHub. So many things are changing, and also taking this into account. While you were talking, I was also thinking all those means of communication, like live communication, Slack, email. How do you make sure to really save the richness of data that is generated within a code review? Like if someone says on Slack, hey, maybe you haven't implemented this architecture pattern correctly, maybe we should do this and that, then where does that information live? How does that reach the code base, that a new person that reads the code can also read this information about stuff that was considered about the code base?
Yeah, that's true. So I think that traceability is a very important aspect as well for code review. So that's, for example, some of the teams that I worked with at Microsoft would require you to somehow put it into the code review when you had, for example, an ad hoc, spontaneous, over-the-shoulder review, that the outcome, at least, of the code review is documented in the code review tool. I think for people that really, so the open source community, for example, that does code review via email, there's the mailing list. And with the mailing list, you have this traceability. Maybe not as much as you want, because you have to search, right? It's based on text search and things like that. But there is some parts of that. And I think the code review tools nowadays more and more look for linkability, so that you can, within your code review tool, you link to your bug tracking, you link to your design documents, you link to your Git commits. So yeah, traceability, I think, is an important part, and people are working on it. How can you make that better? Because there's a lot of information. So for example, if you're in your IDE, should you see the comments that happened on that line, but which one should you look at, right? They are not all as relevant. Maybe the typos you don't have to look at. They don't give you so much information, but if there was a design discussion, maybe you should have access to that information. So I think people are working on that, and it's getting better, but there's plenty to do that can be improved.
There's one last topic I want to talk about, and I know you tweet a lot about code reviews, about working remote, about starting a company. And there's one tweet that really hit me that I read a while ago where you said, during code reviews, you have to balance speed and rigor. You can have a 3-hour code review where you really catch everything, or you can have a 5-minute code review where maybe some useful things are said, but definitely not everything. So how do you balance those things? How do you know when to do the one form and when to do the other?
Yeah, well, that's sweet. I'm a super curious person and I really love to hear what others think. So that was the origin for this tweet. And I kept the tweet on purpose. I kept it quite open. So it was vague. And I wanted to see how people interpret this tweet. And many people, I think, interpreted it as you said, that they look at their personal experience and how fast they actually go over one single review, right? So you get some code and how much time do you spend on that review? And funnily, I gave a talk about that in a tech event recently where it's called, "Oh no, I'm the slowest code reviewer on the team," right? Where we discussed, and that's also what I do in my workshops. So we discuss what does it mean to be the slowest code reviewer on the team, right? What are the implications? And should I go, should I spend a lot of time? Should I be very specific? Should I use my checklist and really look at each line? Or, could I just, look over it and say, oh, it looks fine to me. But what I also had in mind when I tweeted that is the overall review process. Because it turns out, how fast you go through that review has only a really small impact on how fast people get their code review feedback. What's much more important for speed and rigor is the overall process that you design. So I would say it's important that you look through the reviews carefully, really carefully, and think, how can I add value? Still have this question in mind, how can I add value here? But also to think about your overall process. Does every code change need a review, right? Does a small trivial change and fix that I know will be okay, do I have to wait, an hour that somebody has time to look over it and says, that's okay? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not saying that it's always one or the other, but to reflect on that. The same. So if you think about speed and rigor, what I really find interesting is, so there's this idea that 2 reviewers is a really good number. There has been studies on that see that the most value is provided by 2 reviewers. If you're adding more, you don't get, as much valuable feedback as before. So there's, there's a curve. But Google, for example, for 70% of their changes, they have only one additional person look over that. And they are obviously missing out on the rigor. And I'm not saying the rigor of that one person, but the overall process rigor, because there is one person less that looks through it. But what they achieve with it is that they have an average 4 hours turnaround time for code reviews, which is really, really fast. Industry standard for advanced companies is 18, 24 hours, something like that, right? Some people wait for weeks for code reviews. This rigor versus speed, I think it's more applicable for the overall process than for the individual. But I like to ask those questions because it shows that people reflect on themselves, right? They think, oh, how fast do I go? Or our code review process is really slow. We should just spend less time, looking at the actual lines of code, whereby the problems and the bottlenecks most of the time lie in the process. And as an individual, again, it's not how fast you go through the code. It's maybe, have you set dedicated times aside? Do you know when you're doing the code reviews, or are the code reviews piling up and you have to wait several days until you do them? Are the code reviews really large? I mean, that's one of the things that it makes really hard. If you have to set 2 hours aside to go through a code review, and you know already it will be overwhelming, that there will procrastination set in and things like that. So this is a personal process perspective to, I think, have a big impact on the speed and the rigor question. Yeah, that was a long answer, but this tweet had very many facets. I liked it a lot because how people answer.
So in essence, I think what you're saying again is it is all about goal setting. At Google, the goal might be speed, turnover speed. So then they do reviews really quickly. But in another company, the goal might be rigor. And then they might have, as a result, a slower turnover time.
Yeah, true. That's very true. Yeah.
One more question. If people want to know more about you or the work you do or the workshops that you give, where can they find more information?
So I have my personal website. It's my name. It's michaelagreiler.com, where you can find everything I write about code reviews, because I write a lot. I also run a newsletter about engineering, software engineering, team building and culture and things like that. And I'm on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. That's M and then Greiler, Greiler. And finally, I have a podcast that I would love if you would listen in. It's called Software Engineering Unlocked, where I interview developers, experienced developers from different companies about their software engineering practices that they have in their companies.
Fantastic. We'll make sure that all of those links are in the show notes, in addition to all the things you said, the tools you mentioned, the papers you referred to. Thanks a lot for being on the show with us today, Michaela.
Yeah, thank you, Felienne. It was really a pleasure.
This is Felienne for Software Engineering Radio.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.